Within a Spring MVC project, we must provide configuration in order to tell our dispatcher servlet how to behave to support our application. What we would do is use the dispatcher-servlet.xml file to configure the beans that will be within our web application context and that will control our request processing in our Spring MVC project. Within the configuration file for our dispatcher, it's very common to use the MVC namespace because it makes the configuration a little bit easier. Let's talk a little bit about what a namespace is. A namespace makes our XML configuration more concise. We're able to specify one tag that is really a shortcut for a large snippet of XML. That larger snippet of XML configuration configures the beans that will control the behavior of our Spring MVC dispatcher servlet. Let's go ahead and add the MVC namespace to our dispatcher servlet configuration file. At the bottom of the editor window, you'll notice this namespaces tab. And we're going to add actually two namespaces, the MVC namespace as well as the context namespace. Now you should be familiar with the context namespace from Spring Core, and the MVC namespace is specific to Spring MVC. Once we add these two namespaces, let's go back to our dispatcher servlet configuration file, and what you'll notice is that the XSD files have been added to our XML file. Here we see the Spring MVC XSD file as well as the Spring Context XSD file. And those will help us so that our XML file is valid and we are using proper tags. So let's save our dispatcher servlet at this point. Now that our namespaces have been added to the configuration file, we're going to use one of the most popular MVC tags, and that's the MVC annotation-driven tag. What this tag does is it configures a number of beans within the Spring WebMVC framework. The MVC annotation-driven tag is going to define the beans that help us map requests to controller methods. It's also going to support data binding, it's going to support custom validation, custom converters that we use for data binding. It's also going to enable JSR 303 validation support, so you can now use annotations for validation. And it also provides a conversion factory that provides us with predefined converters for common data types like date and number. There's a lot of features that this one snippet of XML grants to our Spring project. Probably the most important configuration specified by this tag is support for the request mapping annotation and for controller annotations, because they really make up the backbone of request processing. While it's outside the scope of the MVC tag, we are going to set up a controller here to demonstrate what this tag enables. If you head to your Package Explorer, we're going to create a new class under the source main Java source folder. So I just used the new dialog and typed class. I selected class. And now we're going to specify the package, which will be com.infiniteskills.mvc.controllers. And then we're going to provide a controller name of home controller. Then simply hit finish once you've specified that. This is going to open up a new class, and we're going to turn this class into a controller by simply using the controller annotation, which was enabled by the MVC annotation-driven tag within our configuration file. Then we're going to add a simple method that returns a string that we're going to call goHome, and it's going to return a string that says welcome home. And now we need to add two annotations to this method. And don't be concerned with these annotations, they're just necessary to run our demonstration. We're more focused on what the MVC annotation-driven tag provides to us, and we will cover these at a later point. The first thing we're going to add is request mapping This is one of the annotations supported by MVC Annotation Driven, and basically it's going to map this URL, which is right now just our context root, and actually let's make it home. It's going to map our root context /home to this method. So this method will get executed once we hit that URL. And we're also going to add the response body tag, which is also enabled by MVC Annotation Driven. And what that says is basically just make this string the body for our response. So once that controller's in place, there's only one other thing we really need to do. We need to tell our IOC container that's going to be associated with this configuration file to pick up our controllers automatically. And if you're familiar with Spring Core, you know that we use the context component scan tag to specify that. And then we can just point to our com.infiniteskills.mvc controllers package. And with the nice autocomplete that's provided by STS, it's very easy to specify that package. At this point, we have our dispatcher servlet configured, and we are relying upon all those beans that were configured by the MVC annotation driven tag to perform our request processing. Now let's return our editor to its normal size. You can do that by hitting Control M or double-clicking the Editor tab. We're going to head over to our Package Explorer. We're going to run this project on the server, so just right-click on the project and go to Run As, and then click on Run on Server. And we see that our application has started up. It opens our browser window. What we want to do now to run our demonstration and see the request processing in action is to hit that URL that we mapped. We have our server name and our port, then we have our context root. Now we specify the home extension on the URL in order to hit that controller we mapped, and it returns us welcome home as we expected. If we go back to our controller, there we see that welcome home was returned when hitting the URL /home, that request mapping, which was enabled by our MVC annotation driven tag, and the MVC namespace was able to map that request. In this lesson, we learned how MVC namespace within Spring MVC can really provide us with a lot of benefits because a lot of the configuration of the dispatcher servlet is provided for us.